Hong ahung benzagura pema sidi hung, hong ahung benzagura pema sidi hung, hong ahung benzagura pema sidi hung. Welcome, everyone, to my Saturday Dharma talk. I am Tseten and thank you, Namaskar, for attending today's talk. Let me just give you my info to begin. If you're interested in this talk, seeing this talk online, or in seeing other talks that I've given online, I do post them to my blog at www.palisuttas.com. My books are also available online at chronikerpress.com, and I do have a YouTube channel. The address is there. I won't read it all out. You can also find it if you type Naked Dharma in YouTube. You will find that channel as the first link that comes up. So thank you very much. And welcome to the first talk in a new series based on the suttas of the Pali Canon. Over the next 34 weeks, I will be committing each weekly session to a sutta of the Pali Canon in order, beginning with the Digha Nikaya, the first Nikaya of the second section of the Pali Canon called the Sutta Pitaka. Those of you who have been attending my talks for some time may recall that I gave a series of talks last year, 10 talks, which I subsequently published as Fundamental View. And this is the same sort of thing, except it's going to be 34 talks, so it will take 34 weeks to complete. The word Nikaya means collection. Sutta Pitaka may be translated as container of discourses. Before we start talking about the sutta specifically, however, in this first introductory talk, I wanted to add a preamble to discuss the Pali Canon itself, since there are Buddhists who study the secondary literature exclusively, or also Mahayana Buddhists who only study the later sutras and are not familiar with pre-sectarian Buddhism. According to tradition, Ananda, the personal attendant of the Buddha for the final 25 years of his life, when the Buddha was between the ages of 55 and 80, would memorize the Buddha's teachings as he gave them. By this time, the Sangha was more or less established, and there were already questions arising as to how to preserve the authenticity of the teachings. Several months after the Buddha's death, during the rainy season, which begins in July in northeast India, the Sangha met to discuss this question. The Buddha's barber, Pali, recited the Vinaya, which finalized the Pratimoksha, the rules of the order, as they had developed over the course of the Buddha's life. Ananda recited the discourses of the Buddha as he had heard them. Sorry, I'm a bit sneezy today, so if I sneeze suddenly, please forgive me. Ananda recited the discourses of the Buddha as he had heard them. Others must have also been involved as well, because not all the suttas are attributed to Ananda. These became the nuclei of the Vinaya and Sutta Pitakas respectively, the Abhidhamma being a later production, probably originated in the 3rd century before the Common Era. In my talk, I also sometimes refer to BCE. If I happen to say BCE instead of before the Common Era, that's what those initials stand for. This occurred about the year 400 BCE, give or take 20 years or so, according to most modern scholars, a significantly more recent date than the traditional date of 544 BCE. The Theravadins did hold an international conference, I guess you could call it, celebration perhaps, in 1956 to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Parinibbana, or death of the Buddha. However, this date is no longer accepted, and it seems more like the 2500th anniversary is coming up around the year 2100. Since the Buddha died at about 80 years of age, his dates may be given as circa 480 to 400 BCE. And I'm just going to turn the voice off for 1 second while I blow my nose. Hold on. Sorry about that. I'm just a little allergic today. Bhikkhu Bodhi, Maurice Walsh, and many others accept this chronology. From the perspective of authenticity, the later date is a good thing, since this is about, though this was not the reason for the revision, so there's no reason to be suspicious. Over the course of the next 300 years, the Sangha recited the Pratimoksha monthly, and the full Vinaya and Sutta Pitakas at unknown intervals, including the first 4 Buddhist councils, which were held about 400 before the Common Era, 295 BCE, 251 BCE, and in the 1st century BCE. It seems such a volume of material was preserved that there must have been more frequent assemblies than that, but those are the official Buddhist councils during that period of time. It is clear that during this time the core material that was received directly from the Buddha's first disciples was codified, clarified, copied, and passed down through a rigorous process of memorization. But this was not something unfamiliar to Indians, who had passed down the Vedas in this way for nearly 2,000 years, and would for another 1,000 years before the Vedas themselves were finally written down. And they were preserved with uncanny accuracy. Although there are no physical books from that time, the suttas themselves show the evidence of this process of preservation, including the use of repetition, stock phrases, and versification. Consequently, it is very tedious to read, albeit fascinating in its details. Additional works were also added to the canon based on earlier traditions. The Pali language in which the canon is preserved is a Prakrit, a vernacular Indic language. Vernacular means natural or common or vulgar. Some people use the word vulgar to refer to it. A language of the people as distinct from a literary language like Sanskrit. It is related to Ardha Magadha, which means half Magadhi. That's the name of the language in which the Jain scriptures were written. The earliest use of Prakrit is attributed to Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and that is in a picture of Ashoka on the slideshow. Originally identified with Magadhi after the Northeast Indian Republic of Magadha, where the Buddha spent much of his time, Pali is now regarded as a partly Sanskritized mixture of several Prakrit languages dating from about the 3rd century before the Common Era. And there's that 3rd century again. You're going to hear that century mentioned a few more times before we finish. It is believed that Pali is a hybrid artificial language that was developed by the Buddhists of the time as a lingua franca in order to preserve the scriptures and to communicate with each other. The fact that this needed to be done shows that Buddhism was already beginning to diversify both linguistically and doctrinally. First written down in Sri Lanka in the 1st century before the Common Era, it appears to have gone through a phase of development in Western India, whereas the Buddha died in Northeast India, so the tradition that was ultimately codified in the Pali Canon clearly went through successive phases of development from Eastern to Northeastern to Western India and then south to Sri Lanka before being written down in the 1st century before the Common Era. From the foregoing, it seems likely that what we know as the Pali Canon achieved something close to its final form prior to the time of Ashoka, who is never mentioned or alluded to in the Pali Canon, perhaps in the early 3rd century before the Common Era. Since Ashoka converted to Buddhism in about 263 BCE, this is only about 137 years after the death of the Buddha based on the new date. For comparison, therefore, the Pali Canon would correspond to the state of development of Christianity in the 2nd century CE, which was the time of the Apostolic Fathers, the early Christian theologians who codified the faith. During the 1st century before the Common Era, Sri Lanka experienced a famine, during which many monastics died. Up to that time, the oral transmission of the Dharma had been rigorously maintained. Writing existed even in the Buddha's time, but it was looked down upon. It was the sort of thing that shopkeepers did, and serious materials were transmitted orally, not in writing. But it was now feared that the Dharma might be lost, So the Pali Canon was finally committed to writing about 29 BCE on smoked and dried palm leaves, and there is a picture of a palm leaf manuscript on the slideshow. Since palm leaf manuscripts are known to have existed as early as the 5th century BCE, and the Brahmi alphabet in which the edicts of Ashoka were written was invented during the 3rd century BCE, one wonders if some of the Pali Canon might not have been written down before this time. However, that's pure speculation on my part. I've seen no discussion of that in the literature. The curvy alphabets, peculiar to Southern Indian and Southeast Asian alphabets, and you can see the curvy letters there in the picture. These were specially adapted to writing on palm leaves, since angular letters tend to split the leaves. Palm leaf books were bound and sent to Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Even by the 1st century BCE, Buddhism was beginning to spread. The suttas were also translated into Chinese, Tibetan, and other languages in the centuries that followed. Each sect had its own canon, and scholars have recently found an extensive Sarvastivadin canon in Afghanistan, which has as yet been little studied, although there is now a project set up online to publish and study the texts. Written on birch bark and dated as early as the 5th century BCE, it is the oldest surviving Buddhist text, older in fact than the Pali Canon. However, scholars have been able to compare many versions of the text, and most scholars now believe that the core set of suttas, the Nikayas, were very consistent between the different schools, with doctrinal differences coming out more in the 3rd section of the Pali Canon, the Abhidhamma. And each school did, in fact, have its own Abhidhamma. Of course, the Pali Canon has an Abhidhamma. That's the Abhidhamma of the Theravada school. Even though the specific origin of the Pali Canon that we have today is Theravada, a sect that itself originated in the 1st century before the Common Era, Peter Harvey opines that, quote, the Theravadins then may have added texts to the canon for some time, but they do not appear to have tampered with what they already had from an earlier period, unquote. Theravadins, of course, are famous for their conservatism. So in this case, conservatism helped to preserve the original texts, even if they disagreed with the Theravada interpretations. Although we can't say that the Pali texts, not even the Nikaya Suttas, preserve the Buddha's actual words, Bhikkhu Bodhi and others have noted that they do faithfully preserve a more or less self-consistent philosophy, and we can certainly study what they do say as a basis for further study. And they are quite intricate, so there is a lot to study there. This does not seem to be, this does seem to be an essential first step. Yet very often, as Peter Macefield has ruefully pointed out, the accepted construction of Buddhist philosophy has all too often been based on a superficial and partial reading of the suttas, based on a few selected passages rather than an extensive and rigorous comparative analysis of the whole oeuvre. This interpretation has now hardened into dogma, sometimes called mainstream or academic Buddhism. Same process has been applied to Christianity, in which it's been attempted to identify the original words of Jesus in the New Testament, and pretty much that boils down to the parables, which is somewhat unsatisfactory for theologians because it's difficult to really flesh out a philosophy from such a meager amount of material. That's in the case of Christianity, of course, which only has a fraction of the material that the Buddhists have, the Pali Canon itself being about 40 volumes in English translation. Richard Gombrich suggests that the alternative approach, whereby Pali linguists try to ferret out the original words of the Buddha based on linguistic criteria, has been discredited, such scholars tending to find what they want to find. And I can attest to this. I attended a course an academic course in Buddhism in which the teacher was a committed Sri Lankan Pali linguist, and he basically constructed the Buddhism that he wanted out of selections that he decided were the original passages. So I can tell you that this is actually what does occur in academia. Moreover, just because a text is more recent does not mean that it does not incorporate older material. Texts that are more recent may also incorporate legitimate implications, not explicit in the earlier texts, or may systematize older doctrines gathered from multiple sources. The more deeply one studies the Pali Canon, the more clear it is that, as Rupert Getton, the current president of the Pali Text Society, has stated, the whole of Buddhist history may be regarded as a working out of the implications of the early scriptures. So from that, I would like you to take away the conclusion that even if you are a Mahayanist, the Pali Canon is by no means irrelevant to you. And if you are a Hinayanist, which in effect means a Theravadan today, since that is the only sect of Hinayana that has survived, perhaps you may be interested in the opportunity to look at the Pali Canon, the Sutta Pitaka rather, directly, rather than through the lens of the Abhidhamma, and perhaps you will be surprised by what you find. That concludes my discussion of the Pali Canon, the introductory part of this talk. Before I continue, does anyone have any questions or concerning any of that? And while you're thinking about that for a moment, I'm just going to turn my voice off to blow my nose again. There, I'm back. Sorry about that. I've been fine all day, and then suddenly I've become very sneezy. Surprise what? Not quite sure what you're referring to. Any questions concerning any of that? Aha, Argus Portal says, you said Theravada holds the origin texts and disagree at the same time. Can you make that more clear, please? Okay. The Pali Canon is divided into three parts: the Vinaya, the Sutta Pitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, the Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Theravada is a sect of Hinayana Buddhism, which is an interpretation of the original texts, essentially. These interpretations are based on the later texts of the Abhidhamma. This is where the schools differentiated themselves from each other. And there are 18 classical schools of the Hinayana. Each one had its own Abhidhamma. Interestingly, each school regards the Abhidhamma as the absolute truth, and the earlier texts as approximations or incomplete, by implication, incomplete or approximate truth. However, the Abhidhamma is certainly a more recent and highly scholastically elaborated work than the earlier texts. Buddhism initially was not sectarian. It was the Dhamma. It was the teachings of the Buddha as they were preserved by his immediate successors. However, over the first 3 centuries, monastics began to disagree with each other about what the meaning of the text was, and they developed these different Abhidhammas. So Theravada is based on the Abhidhamma, and the constituent texts of the Vinaya and the Sutta Pitaka do not necessarily correlate with those interpretations. This is to their credit in that they did not change the texts. These are texts that they preserved from the pre-sectarian period. To their credit, they did not change what they received, at least not totally. They certainly were edited and re-edited, and certainly changes were made, but it was not a whitewash. They were not radically transformed into a mirror image of what each sect thought, or in this case, to answer your question, what the Theravadins thought. They kept their sectarian views largely for the Abhidhamma, and if they received texts, they largely preserved those texts as they were received. So they preserved texts from the pre-sectarian period, which don't necessarily correlate with Theravadan interpretations. If you read Bhikkhu Bodhi's book, his anthology of Pali Canon texts, called In the Words of the Buddha, I believe, or something like that, he acknowledges this in a couple of footnotes. There's a couple of places, he is the darling of Theravada. He is one of the world's foremost Buddhist translators, and was until recently living in Theravada monasteries in Sri Lanka. He now lives in a Chinese Mahayana monastery in New Jersey, interestingly. But he acknowledges there's a couple of footnotes. One is in connection with the Bardo, which the Theravadins reject, but which Bhikkhu Bodhi says there are Pali texts which unequivocally refer to the Bardo concept. Not that word, obviously. That's the Tibetan word. And the other one, there's another one as well, which I don't recall exactly what the point was, that differed from the official Theravada view. The same thing occurs in Christianity. If you look at the sayings of Jesus in the New Testament, not all of them correspond to Catholic theological orthodoxy. But nonetheless, although the Catholics excluded a large number of Christian texts from their compilation of the New Testament, even in that compilation there are texts which don't support Catholic dogma, but they didn't change the texts. They respected the texts and left them in. Somewhat long answer. Does that answer your question? In this series, of course, we're going to be looking at the Sutta Pitaka, so we're going to be looking at the text, the original suttas themselves, and we're going to be looking at them with fresh eyes, not from a Theravadin perspective. So I am not going to force these into any kind of sectarian structure. We're simply going to look at the texts week by week, one by one, themselves, with minimal reference to the commentaries, and see what we find, without any sectarian biases whatsoever. Well, my sectarian bias is that I'm open to all sects. So, I mean, that's a sectarian bias also, right? I'm a universalist, so I'm interested in the views of, I'm interested in all interpretations, which is universalism, or Ekayana, as it's called in the Mahayana. And that, of course, itself is a sect, or a view, and a view is a sect. So even non-sectarianism is a sect. But I'll try to be as open-minded and eclectic and comprehensive as I can. Tokito Ibi asks, but is about Syrians, Kabul, or Africans? I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I don't believe that there is a Middle Eastern or African influence on the Pali Canon. So if that's what you're asking me, that's my answer. Any other questions before we proceed? I'll break at intervals for questions and answers rather than leaving to the end, because this is a fairly long talk today. I was hearing to speak about some little everything. Okay, well, not quite that everything. I have a broad familiarity with non-Buddhist traditions, and to an extent, I will incorporate some references from non-Buddhist traditions where they're relevant to what we might like to call the perennial philosophy. Sometimes these are helpful in understanding Buddhist texts, and I'm not afraid to refer to non-Buddhist traditions when they are relevant. That won't be my focus in interpreting the suttas, but even in today's talk, you will find that from time to time I will allude to something from outside the Buddhist sphere considered in a narrow way. Okay, so today we'll be looking at the first sutta of the Pali Canon in the translation of Maurice Walsh, published by Wisdom Publications, Boston, originally in 1987 and reprinted in 1995. This book is available if you want to get a copy and read the texts, follow along with me from week to week. However, if you don't wish to pay for the text or you don't wish to do that, Pali Canon in Sudan. There is in Afghanistan. I think I referred to that before you came into the Deer Park to Quito. But yes, there is a new canon that has been fairly recent in earthen jars, in fact, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is a large section. I don't think it's quite complete, but it's nearly complete. It's a nearly complete Sarvastivadin canon of texts comparable to those of the Pali Canon, including texts of the Pali Canon. So this is a very, very interesting find, and it is the texts date from the 1st century of the Common Era. So these are by far the earliest physical texts that have been discovered. The Pali texts do, in fact, go back to that time period, but the physical texts that we have do not. So it'll be very interesting to compare this Sarvastivadin canon with the Pali canon and to see where they are similar and see where they differ. And this will give us a lot of more insight into earlier pre-sectarian Buddhism, since up until that find, we didn't really have anything else from that period. So as I was about to say, if you don't wish to get a copy of the Maurice Walsh translation, you can also find translations of these suttas online. Access to Insight has a lot of them, possibly all of them. So I will announce at each talk the next sutta that we will be discussing on the following Saturday. And if you would like to read that sutta before we meet to discuss it, then that would be very beneficial, I think. Although I have written the talks in such a way that if you don't do that, you will still gain a lot from the talk. But obviously, your comprehension will be deepened if you read the text first. As always, these talks will be made available in Second Life on Note Card, and will be posted to my blog located at www.palisuttas.com. Okay, I actually do have a link. This year, I assume, KJ Englewood, you're asking me about the Afghanistan canon. On the note card, there is a bibliography, and in the bibliography, there is a set of references at the end, and one of those is actually a link to an article on that find. And if you go to that article, just for the suttas, okay, I can give you today's. I don't have next week's yet, but there's the link for today's. And when I post, I will also be posting it as a notice in my Dharma Transmission to the West group. So if you join, I would suggest you join that group, and I will post a notice with the name of the sutta and a link to it on the Saturday or Sunday before the Saturday in which I'll be discussing that sutta. So that will give you a week to read it. The next one, I don't have a link for the next one right now, as I've been working all yesterday and today on today's talk. So where am I now? So as always, these talks will be made available in Second Life on Note Card and will be posted to my blog located at www.palisuttas.com. And also my talks are being archived in Second Life in the Mount Everest sim. I'll just type the name there. chat. If you go to the Mount Everest Sim and you look for the Buddhist college and then you look for the library, in the library there's a table, and on the table there's a bunch of scrolls, and if you click the scrolls you can obtain note cards of many of my talks. I am providing them with all my current talks, and I will be providing them with all my past talks as well. So they have a fairly good collection now, but I don't believe they necessarily have everything I've done. But soon they will have all the talks that I've done. These talks are also going to be published as a book late next year. The last set of 10 talks I gave last year is available as a book called Fundamental Views, 10 Talks on the Pali Canon. So essentially I'm doing the same thing this time, except it will be 34 chapters instead of 10 chapters. And this will be the first of a series of commentaries on the Pali Canon that I hope to write over the next few years. The Brahmajala Sutta is the first sutta in the Digha Nikaya because it is the longest, not because it has any special significance. Unlike Genesis in the Bible, for example, which is first because it begins with the creation of the world, logically enough. The organization of the Pali Canon is more like that of the Quran. The suttas are arranged in non-chronological order from longest to shortest, just as they are in the Quran. Thus, the title of the Digha Nikaya is the Long Collection. That is to say, this is the collection of the longest suttas. Walsh mentions that there is no satisfactory translation of the word sutta. From Sanskrit sutra, string or thread, hence strings of rules hanging together like threads, or that which, like a thread, runs through and holds together everything. The Pali English Dictionary says that comes from SIV, to sew, and you can see the root is practically identical with the English word sew, showing the common Indo-European roots of both Pali and English. Hence that which is sewn together. Maurice Walsh translates the title of the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Supreme Net. In Pali, excuse me, in Pali, jala means net or entanglement. Brahma refers to Brahma, the creator in the Vedic or Brahmin religion, but of course Buddhism rejects the concept of a supreme deity, all deities or devas in Buddhism being limited and relative. It is interesting, therefore, that this sutta is largely about what the teaching is not, to use the subtitle assigned to the work by Walsh. However, let's look more closely into the meaning of this word. Brahmas do exist in Buddhism. They occupy the 12th through 14th levels of samsara, called the retinue of Brahma, the Brahma Parasaja Deva, the ministers of Brahma, the Brahma Purohita Deva, and the great Brahmas, the Mahabrahma. The beings that inhabit these realms enjoy the first jhana, or meditative accomplishment, characterized by thinking, pondering, detachment, delight, and happiness. The most famous inhabitant of this realm is God, who is the first Deva, the word literally means shining one, to be born into a new universe. He perceives that he is alone, so he jumps to the conclusion that he is the creator and Lord of the universe, a great delusion, of course. The description Tukito asks, Sudan, it's really being talked into talking. Sorry, I don't follow that question at all, so I'm not able to answer it. The description suggests the demiurge of the Gnostic religion, which makes one wonder if there is a Buddhist influence on Gnosticism. Edward Kantz and Elaine Pagels have suggested that there is, but the view has not gained widespread acceptance in academia. Perhaps when you hear Sudan, I'm saying Sutta. The Pali Sutta, the discourses of the Buddha. That said, the Buddha was often asked how one could achieve union with Brahma, and in a remarkable anticipation of Christianity, He recommended the metta meditation on compassion to this end. Those who succeed in this practice will be reborn in the Brahma realm, which is the lowest level of the fine material world, the Rupa Loka, the next realm above our own sensual realm, characterized by sensual desire, characterized by individuality and form, but without sensual desire, that is the Rupa Loka. The Brahma world is very similar to the Semitic concept of heaven. Sahampati, the great Brahma, appeared to the Buddha when he hesitated to teach shortly after his enlightenment, and entreated him to teach for the salvation of the world. None of these meanings seems to be very close to the content of the Sutta, however, which is primarily concerned with moral practices and wrong views. So let's look deeper into the meaning of this word. According to the Pali English Dictionary, the word Brahma comes from the root brh, the root of brahant, which means to increase, to be great or strong. Rhys Davids relates it to the power or greatness of prayer or the ecstatic mind. In Buddhism, it refers to the supreme good, or a mystic formula, prayer, or mantra. Hence, the Brahmins were the chanters of the Vedic hymns, prayers, or mantras. In this context, Brahma appears to mean simply great, or ultimate, combined with net, meaning entanglement or delusion. The Sutta, therefore, seems to be about the great entanglement, what the teaching is not, in Walsh's words, and by implication, therefore, what the teaching is. And we'll have more to say about that in the conclusion. Bodhi's translation, the all-embracing net of views, is somewhat odd in the context, although not impossible. You will notice that most suttas begin with the expression, "Thus have I heard." These words are traditionally assigned to Ananda, who is reputed to have recited the entire text of the Sutta Pitaka from memory. He was renowned for his photographic memory in a society which itself was renowned for feats of memorization, as I discussed in the introduction. However, in his article, "Thus Have I Heard," Maurice Walsh suggests that "Thus have I heard," ewang me sutang in Pali, was a standard way of opening a narrative the speaker knew by hearsay, not from personal experience. It also, I think, disposes, and now I'm quoting Walsh actually, pardon me, that is a quotation from Walsh, "Thus have I heard, ewang me sutang," was a standard way of opening a narrative the speaker knew by hearsay and not from personal experience. It also, I think, this is Walsh speaking, disposes of the commentarial idea that the phrase was Ananda's in introducing the various suttas, unquote. In other words, these words simply identify the sutta as a traditional teaching that has been handed down from the past. The location of the sutta is the main road between Rajagaha, which is modern Rajgir, in the Nalanda district of the Indian state of Bihar, the ancient capital of Magadha, and Nalanda, about 12 kilometers or 7 miles north. This is a major trade route, and there's the picture. Those are the Rajgir Hills in the background with a road in front. It's the best I could do. This was a major trade route. Magadha was one of the 16 great countries, the Mahajanapadas, and had a republican or democratic administration with separation of powers. It corresponds to southern Bihar and parts of East Bengal today. Magadha was an influential cultural center that influenced both Jain and Buddhist beliefs. It was ruled by the Haryanka dynasty from 684 to 413 before the Common Era and consisted of 80,000 villages. Apparently, the extent of it was approximately 300 hours, take 300 hours to walk from one side of it to the other, or from the bottom to the top. Nalanda was, of course, the site of the famous Buddhist university, named after the city which flourished from the 5th to the 12th centuries before it was destroyed by the Muslim invaders. It is said that its library burned for 3 months. At the time of the Buddha, it was a small city. The Buddha was traveling along this road with his entourage, followed by Suppiya and his younger disciple Brahmadatta. Suppiya and Brahmadatta were parabhajakas, wandering religious mendicants. The word means literally wandering men. Some of these were Brahmins who went about clothed, unlike some other ascetics, and they were philosophers, but primarily philosophers who delighted in intellectual argument and debate. Suppiya was a follower of Sanjaya Belataputta, and that's a picture of Sanjaya, his guru Sanjaya Belataputta there. The Buddha's two chief disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, were former disciples of Sanjaya, that is the guru, Sanjaya Belataputta. Hence, some bad blood appears to have been involved on Suppiya's part. Sanjaya appears to have been a skeptical agnostic. Walsh calls him a positivist, neither affirming nor denying such things as other worlds, the fruits of karma, and life after death. It does come as a surprise to some people to learn, because we associate India with spiritual philosophy, we don't realize how diverse the society of the Buddha's time was. In fact, there were many different philosophies, all vying for attention, and materialism was one of those philosophies. So even in the 5th century before the Common Era, there were materialists and agnostics. And we'll be hearing more about the agnostics later on. Sanjaya and Brahmadatta were engaging in a vigorous discussion of the merits and demerits of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, in which Sanjaya was denigrating and Brahmadatta defending them in voices loud enough to be heard by all, apparently. At the day's end, the Buddha, his entourage, to which the Sutta assigns the unlikely number of 500 monastics, and this is something you're going to see frequently in the Pali Canon. Inflating descriptions, especially numbers, is a common conceit of the Pali Canon. So one shouldn't take the numbers too seriously. So the Buddha, his entourage, Suppiya, and Brahmadatta all stopped together at the royal park of Ambalatika, literally the mango sapling. This was, of course, on the road between Rajgir, Rajagaha, and Nalanda. This appears to have been a kind of rest house erected in the bamboo grove. Buddhaghosa says, quote, "Here, Ambalatika is the king's park. At the entrance stood a young mango tree called Ambalatika by the people. Consequently, the park itself came to be known as Ambalatika. It was well watered, shady, surrounded by a rampart, securely fastened with gates and protected like a casket. Within the park was a house ornamented with magnificent paintings for the king's relaxation. This was known as the Royal Rest House. Thus there were two, unquote. Thus there were two buildings in the park, one for the king's use and one for the use of travelers, especially religious travelers, samanas. Early the next morning, the Buddha's entourage got up early, as it was their wont. This is a stock description that describes the Buddha's day, the day of the Buddha and his entourage. They always got up early, the crack of dawn at the latest, sometimes before dawn. So the Buddha's entourage got up and sat together in a place, presumably in the same park called the Round Pavilion, possibly some sort of gazebo. Here, it seems they discussed the things that were being said by Suppiya and Brahmadatta in relation to the Buddha, although this is rather obliquely expressed in the Sutta. Hence, this is how we know that the Suppiya and Brahmadatta were speaking loudly enough to be heard by all, barring telepathy. Some time later, the Buddha joined the monastics and asked them what they were discussing, so they told him. The Buddha told the monastics that they should not be angry, resentful, or upset with someone who disparages the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha, as that would be a hindrance to them, since the emotion of anger would bias their judgment. Instead, they should simply explain what is incorrect with an attitude of perfect dispassion. Similarly, the Buddha told the monastics that they should not be pleased, happy, or elated with someone who praises the Buddha, Dharma, or Sangha, since that too would be a hindrance, since the emotion of happiness would also bias bias their judgment. Instead, they should simply explain what is correct. This first teaching of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, is refreshingly unique in the history of religions, since it discounts the value of emotion, whether of anger or happiness, and of faith in favor of a calm assessment of the truth, and therefore the importance of rational, objective analysis, even in the context of spiritual matters. This implies, in turn, that spiritual matters can be evaluated in this way, or such an injunction would make no sense. How few, even amongst Buddhists, have recognized the importance of these pivotal principles and applied them to their own mode of thinking in the spiritual realm. The Buddha then drops this bombshell, and here it begins to get exciting, which decisively separates Buddhism from every religion of which I am aware. Quote, "It is, monks, for elementary, inferior matters of moral practice that the worldling would praise the Tathagata." Unquote. The word that Walsh translates as worldling is puttajana. This is generally explained as puttu, many, plus jana, folk, an ordinary average person, a common worldling, a man of the people, an uneducated or ignorant person. Just going to make, since the sun is going down, there we go, that's better. The word Tathagata is the word that the Buddha uses with reference to himself. This, all through the Pali Canon, he refers to himself in the third person as the Tathagata, and this word is introduced in the Sutta. This word is somewhat mysterious. It is an epithet of an arhat, and non-Buddhists are assumed to have known what it meant. According to the Pali English Dictionary, the compilers of the Nikayas regarded it as pre-Buddhist, and yet the word has never been found in any non-Buddhist work. Moreover, although it is an epithet of an arhat, it is only ever used of the Buddha, especially by the Buddha with reference to himself in the third person. Although the derivation is uncertain, it may be glossed as follows, and I'm just going to put this in the chat so you can follow it a little more easily. So it consists of ta, this, that, just this or that, even this or these, referring back to somebody or something just mentioned, or this now, indicating something immediately following the statement of the speaker. Tata, so, thus, and not otherwise, in this way, likewise. Compare tat, that in Sanskrit, referring to suchness, or reality as it is. Compare the Pali tata, the real nature, reality. Agata, come, arrived. Ga, going. Agata is, of course, the past tense. Ga is the present tense. Gata, gone, gone away, arrived at, directed to, and ta, the same as before. Tathagata. This is often glossed as he who has thus come and gone, commonly represented visually as a series of footsteps with no beginning and with no discernible end. Buddhaghosa suggests 8 possible meanings. 1. He who has arrived in such fashion. 2. He who has walked in such fashion. 3. He who by the path of knowledge has come at the real essentials of things. 4. He who has won truth. 5. He who has discerned truth. 6. He who declares truth. 7. He whose words and deeds accord. And 8. The great physician whose medicine is all-potent. Modern Sanskritists boil the meaning of the word down to 2 alternatives. The one who has gone or arrived at suchness, or one like that, with the implication of immobility or freedom from transitoriness. In each case, suchness, or that, is an essential factor. At the end of the sutta, the Buddha himself declares the nature of a Tathagata. Monks, this is quoting, monks, the body of the Tathagata stands with the link that bound it to becoming cut. As long as the body subsists, devas and humans will see him. However, at the breaking up of the body and the exhaustion of the lifespan, devas and humans will see him no more. Monks, just as when the stalk of a bunch of mangoes has been cut, all the mangoes on it go with it, just so the Tathagata's link with becoming has been cut. As long as the body subsists, devas and humans will see him. But at the breaking up of the body and the exhaustion of the lifespan, devas and humans will see him no more." Unquote. This statement need not imply that the Tathagata ceases to exist at death. In fact, the metaphor of the mangoes suggests rather the opposite. Rather, he ceases to exist as a transitory samsaric being, and thus becomes invisible to samsaric beings, both devas and humans. The only thing remaining to keep the Buddha in incarnation is the energy or vitality of the lifespan. After the exhaustion of which he will be freed forever from the cycle of rebirth. Now that we have examined these two words, which will recur frequently throughout the suttas, let us look again at this remarkable statement of the Buddha and consider what it means. The Bodhi translation says, quote, and these words are so significant that I am quoting them in the different translations. "It is bhikkhus only to trifling and insignificant matters, to the minor details of mere moral virtue, that a worldling would refer when speaking in praise of the Tathagata." Unquote. How utterly distinct from the self-righteous moralizing of religion this statement is. We find this attitude in all religions. Many students of religion will tell you that morality is the essence of religion, from religio, moral obligation, or religare, to bind fast. That's, of course, the Latin roots of the English word religion. For many religions, morality is everything. Even in Buddhism today, that is to say, in religious Buddhism today, how often are we told that first one must perfect the rules of moral conduct, especially as a monastic, followed by meditation in order to obtain wisdom, the final accomplishment, a construction that, as we shall see in this series of talks, is precisely the opposite of what the Buddha taught. We read this in popular Buddhist books all the time. For many people, following the rules is the practice, and the more rules you follow, the holier you are. Thus, from this perspective, a monk is superior to a householder because he follows 227 rules, compared to 331 rules for a nun. And yet the greater number of rules for women is not an indication of superiority, but rather of their inferior status as a female. And we shall also have occasion to discuss this view, too, later in the series. Those of you who attended my talk on the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition have already been introduced to this topic and the whole question of the Buddha's view of women. However, here the Buddha says that these are elementary, inferior, trifling, and insignificant matters, mere details that an uneducated, common, inferior person would praise, but not by implication a superior person. Rhys Davids refers to trifling things, quoting, "Trifling things, of matters of little value, of mere morality, that an unconverted man, when praising the Tathagata, would speak," unquote. So there you have that passage in the three major translations of this text. So what are the things that the Buddha finds so inferior about moral practice? Perhaps they are merely superficial ethical observances that have little or nothing to do with the spiritual life. I am seeing comments passing from time to time in the nearby chat. That's perfectly fine if you'd like to make a comment. However, I will only respond to questions in the interests of efficiency. Perhaps they are merely superficial ethical observances that have little or nothing to do with the spiritual life, like matters of etiquette, that sort of thing. That would make sense. In addition, here we encounter the second bombshell, and here it gets more exciting. For what the Buddha elaborates in detail in the next 6 pages in the English translation of Maurice Walsh, are not mere formalities. No, he lists the essential rules of the entire Vinaya, starting with Pansil, the 5 precepts, starting with not killing, followed by not stealing, chastity, and no false speech. Notice, too, that he does not even mention alcohol, an omission that occurs frequently throughout the Pali texts, and I will have occasion to be discussing that later on in the series as well. He then expands the list to include the 8 precepts, namely eating at the wrong time, singing, dancing, playing music, attending entertainment performances, wearing perfume, and using cosmetics and garlands, using high or wide beds. Then the list expands to include the 10 precepts, namely accepting money. Moreover, the list continues to include not damaging seeds and crops, not accepting raw grain or flesh, women and young girls, male or female slaves, sheep and goats, cocks and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses and mares, fields and lots. Not running errands, buying and selling, cheating with false weights and measures, bribery and corruption, deception and insincerity, wounding, killing, imprisoning, highway robbery, and taking food by force. All these things the Buddha regards as matters of mere moral practice. This completes the section, the short section on morality, which summarizes the things for which the worldling would praise the Tathagata. Note that the Buddha does not state that these things are in fact allowed. That's not the implication that I'm trying to make. Unless we assume that the Buddha sanctions murder, this is not his point. His point appears to be that these are merely superficial moral observances, matters of conduct that, while appropriate, perhaps even necessary, really fall below the status of the Tathagata, who is far beyond such considerations, one might even say beyond good and evil, and that the admiration of the common, uneducated folk for such things really misses the point. In the middle section on morality, these practices are elaborated in greater detail, and some new items are added, including not destroying seeds, not enjoying stored-up goods, not attending displays, not indulging in idle pursuits, not using high and wide beds, not adorning oneself, refraining from unedifying conversation, refraining from disputation, refraining from errand running, and refraining from deception. Finally, in the large section on morality, the Buddha describes the kinds of practices that we might regard as questionable. Making one's living by the practice of base arts. That's a quotation. Base arts, including palmistry, divining by signs, portents, dreams, body marks, mouse gnawings, fire oblations, oblations from a ladle, husks, rice powder, rice grains, ghee, oil, the mouth, or blood. Reading the fingertips. House and garden lore, skill in charms, ghost lore, earth house lore, snake lore, poison lore, rat lore. Thank you, Swami Luminos, for attending. If you would like a copy of this talk, simply send me an IM and I'll be happy to provide you with a copy of the note card. That applies, of course, to anyone. Generally, I prefer it if you send me the IM at the end of the talk, however, if you can. So, continuing with the list, snake lore, poison lore, rat lore, bird lore, crow lore, foretelling a person's lifespan, charms against arrows, knowledge of animals' cries, judging the marks of gems, sticks, clothes, swords, spears, arrows, weapons, women, men, boys, girls, male and female slaves, elephants, horses, buffaloes, bulls, cows, goats, rams, cocks, quail, iguanas, bamboo rats, tortoises, and deer, predicting matters related to war, astronomical phenomena, the weather or the outcome, including harvests, security, danger, disease, and health, perhaps a reference to astrology, accountancy, computing, calculating, poetic composition, philosophizing, arranging marriages, engagements, or divorces, declaring the time for saving, spending, bringing good or bad luck, procuring abortions, spells, getting answers with a mirror, girl medium or a deva, worshipping the sun or great Brahma, thus refuting any suggestion that Buddhism is theistic, breathing fire, invoking the goddess of luck, probably Lakshmi, appeasing devas and redeeming vows to them, making earth house spells, causing virility or impotence, preparing and consecrating building sites, giving ritual rinsings and bathings, making sacrifices, giving emetics, purges, expectorants, and phlegmagogues, giving ear, eye, or nose medicines, ointments, or counter-ointments, surgery, including eye surgery, podiatry or pediatrics, and countering the side effects of previous remedies using bombs. Many of these practices are associated with Brahmanism, which the Buddha repudiated. The short and middle sections on morality appear to be an early version of the Vinaya rules, so esteemed by monastics, yet they are declared by the Buddha to be trivial. Nor is this the only place in the Pali Suttas where the Buddha makes such statements about the Vinaya. The large section on morality includes a variety of practices with certain discernible characteristics, all subsumed under the heading base arts. Many of these correspond to practices that we would associate with magic, sorcery, or witchcraft. The third group is particularly associated with wrong livelihood by monastics, which has led to some to suggest that these practices are not necessarily prohibited in themselves, but only prohibited for monastics. But this interpretation, attractive though it might be, is refuted by the phrase base arts. This leads to some difficulties, however, because not all of the practices described fit into what we might think of as debased, including house and garden lore, foretelling a person's lifespan, insurance companies do this routinely, knowledge of animals' cries, which are being studied seriously by science today, predicting astronomical phenomena, predicting earthquakes, predicting the weather, agricultural forecasting, accounting, computing, calculating, poetic composition, philosophizing, and medical arts, including prescribing drug remedies and surgeries. One theme that runs through the items is that of prediction, which the Buddha seems to have associated with magic. Of course, science in the Buddha's day was different from today. Perhaps he regarded some items that we would regard as science today as pseudoscience or harmful. One thinks of medicine, for example, which was regarded as actually harmful almost until the modern era, actually. Medical doctors were notorious, all through the Middle Ages, certainly. In any case, the inclusion of these items suggests that we cannot interpret the suttas in a naive, literalistic, or fundamentalistic way. We should regard them seriously, of course, but try to discern the intent underlying them, without falling into superstitious reverence for rites, rituals, and dogmatic beliefs. That completes the summary of the things for which the vulgar, uneducated common person, the Puthajjana or worldling, would praise the Buddha, following which the Buddha says, quote, "There are amongst other matters, profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, excellent, beyond mere thought, subtle, to be experienced by the wise, which the Tathagata, having realized them by his own super-knowledge, proclaims, and about which those who would truthfully praise the Tathagata would rightly speak." Unquote. This passage further elucidates our understanding of the first section in which the moral practices are summarized. Based on this passage, we may further clarify the moral practices as superficial, the opposite of profound, obvious, the opposite of hard to see, easy to understand, the opposite of hard to understand, conceptual, opposite of beyond mere thought, and to be experienced by the ignorant, opposite of to be experienced by the wise. The Tathagata himself, therefore, is also profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, excellent, beyond mere thought, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. The reference to super-knowledge is an extension of beyond mere thought. The implication is that there is a wisdom that transcends mere logic, which is reserved for those who have attained to it, and which transcends mere moral practice. In English, we have a word for this kind of wisdom. It is gnosis, and this transrational knowledge or wisdom was the special preoccupation of the early Gnostics, both Christian and non-Christian, before the Roman Catholic Church exterminated them. The message is that while morality may be necessary, it is superficial and inadequate. We shall see this concept elaborated later on in the suttas when we come to discuss upaya, skillful means. Oops, there we go. In the next section, the 62 kinds of wrong views, the Buddha moves from moral practices to an itemization of erroneous philosophical positions. This is essentially a catalogue of philosophical views held by other schools at the time of the Buddha that the Buddha held to be false, including 18 speculative theories about the past and 44 speculative theories about the future. All of these theories pertain to various views of the nature of the self and the world, and are based on one or a combination of 3 modes of reasoning. Okay, Taquito, thank you for coming. If you would like a copy of the note card of this talk, simply send me an IM and I'll be happy to provide you with one. I'm interpreting your message to mean you have to leave. All of these theories pertain to various views of the nature of the self and the world, and are based on one or combination of 3 modes of reasoning: empirical observation, logical or rational argumentation, or even direct spiritual realization, as we shall see. Taquito, I think you're asking me if I sent you the note card already because you've refused an offer of something, and no, I have not. But if you would like a copy, simply send me an IM and I will send it to you. At the end, preferably. The Buddha identifies 4 theories that he calls eternalist, 4 theories that he calls of the note card for the talk. The Buddha identifies 4 theories that he calls eternalist, 4 theories that he calls partly eternalist and partly non-eternalist, 4 theories that he calls finitist and infinitist, 4 theories that he calls eel-wrigglers, and 2 theories that he calls chance originationists. These add up to 18 theories. Similarly, the Buddha identifies the following speculative theories about the future: 16 doctrines of conscious post-mortem survival, 8 doctrines of unconscious post-mortem survival, 8 doctrines of neither conscious nor unconscious post-mortem survival, 7 doctrines of annihilationists, and 5 ways of proclaiming Nibbana here and now. These add up to 44 theories, and if you add up these 2 groups of theories, they add up to 62 wrong views. So from the foregoing, one can arrive at the following list of 9 essential theories, and I'll put those in the chat so you can see them quite simply. So these are 1, eternalism, 2, partly eternalism and partly non-eternalism, 3, finitism, 4, non-infinitism, 5, eel-wriggling, 6, chance originationism, 7, post-mortem survivalism, 8, annihilationism, and 9, Nibbana here and now. The first 6 concern the past, and the last 3 concern the future. These are presumably theories that were current at the time of the Buddha. Let's examine these theories and see what they say, remembering that the Buddha rejected all of them. Eternalism asserts that the self and the world are eternal based on 4 arguments. First, the recollection of past lives that results from a state of mental concentration or meditation. This is interesting in itself, in that the Buddha himself is reputed to have attained this state at his enlightenment. The spontaneous arising of past life memories has also been documented in recent times in the context of near-death experiences, or NDEs, psychedelic experiences, Kundalini awakening, Rolfing, and various traumas. Ian Stevenson has also studied thousands of cases of spontaneous past life memory in children. However, the eternalist infers from these experiences that the self and the world are eternal. The second view is similar to the first, except that one period of universal contraction and expansion of the universe is remembered as distinct from individual past lives. The third is almost the same as the second, except that multiple periods of contraction and expansion are remembered. Whereas the first 3 arguments are essentially empirical, The fourth argument is based on a priori logical reasoning. Thus, the eternalist asserts the eternity of the self and the world. In fact, these arguments suggest Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence. Note that the Buddha is not denying here the experience of rebirth or the expansion and contraction of universes. This is part of the Buddhist worldview. Only the Buddha is denying that the eternity of the self and the world follows from these facts, so it is a case of false inference. The partly eternalism and partly non-eternalism doctrine is the view that God is eternal, but that subordinate beings are non-eternal. The first argument for this view is that when a lower world contracts, discussed above, the beings living in that world are reborn in a higher world, not subject to contraction. This doctrine remarkably presages scientific cosmology, specifically the theory of the Big Bang. After a long time, the lower world begins to expand again, and a being from a higher world is reborn there, either as a result of the exhaustion of his lifespan or the exhaustion of his merit. After a long time, other beings appear, and he thinks he is the first cause, and they think he is God for the same reason. The ascetic who remembers one past life because of meditation remembers this life, and he concludes that the first being is permanent and that the later beings are all impermanent. Thus, he concludes that the world is partly eternal and partly non-eternal. The second argument is like the first, based on the recollection of a single past life because of meditation. In this case, the ascetic in his past life was a type of deva called corrupted by pleasure. These are a class of devas, or this is a class of devas, who expend an excessive amount of time addicted to merriment, play, and enjoyment, and so fall into the human state. When they remember this past life, they conclude that the devas who are not addicted to pleasure are permanent, but they are impermanent, and so conclude that the world is partly eternal and partly non-eternal. The third argument is like the second, except that in this case, the ascetic remembers a previous birth as a class of deva called corrupted in mind. These dwell in the realm of the four great kings, the Chatu Maharajika devas, the next plane above the human world. Instead of being corrupted by pleasure, however, like the corrupted by pleasure devas, these beings are corrupted by envy. Seeing the long life of the non-envious devas, they fall into the same error of believing those devas to be eternal and themselves to be non-eternal. Finally, the fourth argument is also an a priori logical or rationalist argument in which the objects of the five senses are perceived to be impermanent, but thought, mind, or consciousness is believed to be permanent, and so the same conclusion above is arrived at. Ooh, and I've missed a slide. Okay, since I've missed a slide, I'll put what would have been on the slide in the chat. There we go. Finitism is the belief that the world is finite and bounded. Infinitism is the belief that the world is infinite and unbounded. In addition, the Buddha refers to the belief that the world is both finite and infinite, and the belief that it is neither finite nor infinite. This is the first reference to a logical structure that we will also find in later suttas, namely x is not x is both x and not x is neither x nor not x. This construction, called the fourfold negation, the tetralemma or chatuskoti in Sanskrit, is a feature of Indian classical logic that is made much use of by the Buddha. We will be discussing this further in connection with later suttas. Each of these beliefs corresponds to a separate argument, but each one comes down to the same thing, the direct realization of the fact because of meditation. Thus, these are less arguments than direct spiritual realizations. The eel wrigglers, my personal favorite, the Amara Vikepika, which can also be translated as endless equivocators, are agnostics who refuse to commit themselves to any position, but simply say, I don't say this, I don't say that, I don't say it is otherwise, I don't say it is not, I don't not say it is not. This belief, if we can call it that, is based on the desire to avoid lying, the desire to avoid attachment, and the desire to avoid cross-examination, which comes simply from not knowing. These are the first three arguments. The fourth argument is because one is dull and stupid. Finally, the final category in the group of speculations about the past is that of the chance originationists, or the chance originationalists. This is the belief that the self and the world arise by chance, and it is based on two arguments. Here, a deva who belongs to the class of devas called unconscious, the asanyasata, is reborn in the human state, and because of mental concentration, he remembers his birth there. From this, he concludes that before he did not exist, now he exists, therefore he has arisen by chance. The second argument is an a priori logical or rationalist argument that the self and the world have arisen by chance. This concludes the summary of speculations concerning the past. The next group of speculations concerns the future. Fortunately, there are only three beliefs here, the first of which that we will consider is post-mortem survivalism. Post-mortem survivalism asserts that after death the self is healthy and conscious and material, immaterial, both material and immaterial, neither material nor immaterial, note the recurrence of the tetralemma, finite, infinite, both neither, of uniform perception, varied perception, limited perception, unlimited perception, happy, miserable, both, and neither. These are the 16 beliefs which really boil down to 4 logical variations of 4 fundamental beliefs concerning materiality, finitude, limitation, and happiness. The doctrine of unconscious post-mortem survival is based on 2 underlying views in all 4 alternatives discussed above, that after death the self is healthy and unconscious, and material or finite, 4 alternatives each. The neither conscious nor unconscious post-mortem survivalists hold that the self is healthy and neither conscious nor unconscious, with the same 8 variations as above. The annihilationists all believe in the annihilation, destruction, and non-existence of the self at death, but differ as to the nature of that self. The 7 views of the self are that it is or has 1. Material, composed of 4 elements or states of matter, product of mother and father or male and female stuff. This corresponds to the dominant view under scientific materialism or secularism in most Western societies and an increasing number of Asian societies today. So there we have the contemporary view expressed, contemporary philosophical materialism or positivism. The next 6 views all accept the reality of the first view, but add a second self that also nevertheless dies. 2, that it is divine, material, sensory, and made of real food. 3, that it is divine, material, mind-made, complete, and not defective in any sense organ, a kind of mental body. 4, that it has attained the sphere of infinite space, the first plane of the formless realm. 5, attained the sphere of infinite consciousness, the second plane of the formless realm. 6, attained the sphere of nothingness, the third plane of the formless realm. And 7, attained the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, the fourth and highest plane of the formless realm. All of these selves, even those that are spiritually advanced, are samsaric and are therefore subject to death. Finally, we come to the final speculation concerning the future, that of Nibbana here and now. These are 5 views concerning the realization of nirvana here and now by existent beings, namely 1, the self experiences nirvana when it indulges in the pleasures of the 5 senses. That again would correspond in most so-called modern societies in the West today, that would correspond to the dominant view. The highest happiness is the indulgence in sensory pleasure. 2, the self experiences nirvana when it experiences the first jhana or meditative accomplishment, characterized by thinking, pondering, detachment, delight, and happiness. This view rejects the previous view because of suffering. 3, the self experiences nirvana when it experiences the second jhana, characterized by inner tranquility and oneness of mind, free from thinking and pondering, born of concentration, and accompanied by delight and joy. This view rejects the previous view because of thinking and pondering. 4. The self experiences nirvana when it experiences the third jhana, characterized by waning of delight, equanimity, mindfulness, and clear awareness, and joy experienced in the body. This view rejects the previous view due to mental exhilaration. And 5. The self experiences nirvana when it experiences the fourth jhana, characterized by the abandonment of pleasure and pain, the disappearance of joy and grief, equanimity and mindfulness. This view rejects the previous view due to joy. That completes the Buddha's summary of the 62 wrong views. At the end of this dissertation, the Buddha comments on all of these views using exactly the same language, and I quote, "This monks the Tathagata understands. These viewpoints thus grasped and adhered to will lead to such and such destinations in another world. This the Tathagata knows, and more, but he is not attached to that knowledge. And being thus unattached, he has experienced for himself perfect peace, and having truly understood the arising and the passing away of feelings, their attraction and peril and the deliverance from them, the Tathagata is liberated without remainder. These monks are those other matters, profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, excellent, beyond mere thought, subtle, to be experienced by the wise, which the Tathagata, having realized them by his own super-knowledge, proclaims, and about which those who would truthfully praise the Tathagata would rightly speak." It is easy to leap to the conclusion, based on the foregoing, that the Buddha held no views on the nature of self and the world, that is, that he rejected ontology, the science of being, altogether, since all of the 62 wrong views relate to the nature of the self and the world in one way or another, including empiricism, rationalism, and direct spiritual realization. And in fact, this view that the Buddha did not have an ontology, this is a view that one finds Buddhists advocating, especially popularly, very commonly. One finds, the Buddha rejected all of this as nonsense. He didn't have an ontology. He didn't speculate about metaphysics. Such a view would make the Buddha an agnostic or even a nihilist, however. I will argue throughout these talks that such a view of the Pali Canon is erroneous for various reasons that we will discuss as they come up in the suttas. In the context of the present sutta, I would point to the Buddha's rejection of the eel-wrigglers, both in this sutta and elsewhere. You will recall the philosophy of the eel-wrigglers. Quote, "When asked about this or that matter, they resort to evasive statements, and they wriggle like eels on four grounds." And they say, they don't affirm, they don't not affirm, they simply have nothing to say. In fact, the Buddha is quite judgmental about eel-wriggling, this being the only view the adherents of which he characterizes as dull and stupid. If one reads his conclusion with attention, one notices various words and statements that imply more than simply not knowing. Quote, "The Tathagata," and I've got italics on some of these words. I'll put it in the chat so you can see. Actually, I don't know if italics will come out in the chat. No, they won't. Okay, I'll just have to do it through emphasis then. So where I emphasize the word, I'm italicizing it. The Tathagata understands. The Tathagata knows, and more, but he is not attached to that knowledge. Beyond mere thought, subtle, to be experienced by the wise, which the Tathagata, having realized by his own super-knowledge, proclaims, and about which those who would truthfully praise the Tathagata would rightly speak. If we reject ontology altogether, then we are left with praxis, that is, moral practice, which the Buddha has already made clear is not appropriate when referring to the Tathagata. Moral practices, as we have shown, are elementary, inferior, trifling, insignificant, minor, of little value, etc. Rather, what the Buddha appears to be alluding to is a mode of knowing that transcends ratiocination, reasoning, and that cannot be arrived at by experience, logic, or even direct spiritual realization, which is referred to as the super-knowledge of the Tathagata, but it can be spoken of. The translogical character of this knowledge is shown by his frequent allusion to the tetralemma, which can be interpreted in various ways. The Buddha's rejection of the 62 wrong views is suggestive of the Buddha's rejection of the concept of rebirth in any samsaric state, because any samsaric state is subject to suffering, a view that we will encounter in later suttas. Thus, the Buddha rejects the religious notion of heaven altogether. Thus, he says, quote, "These viewpoints thus grasped and adhered to will lead to such and such destinations in another world," unquote. This is, of course, the concept of rebirth based on the law of karma. Here two things must be distinguished: the viewpoint itself, which the Buddha designates as wrong view, and the attachment that leads to samsaric rebirth. Thus the Buddha says, quote, "This the Tathagata knows and more," implying a super-knowledge that transcends wrong view, "but he is not attached to that knowledge," unquote. Thus two things are necessary: the acquisition of a trans-rational super-knowledge that transcends and corrects the 62 wrong views, and you will, of course, not fail to notice that the opposite of wrong view is right view, which is, of course, the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path, the step that leads to the stage of stream entry or stream winning. And secondly, non-attachment. In other suttas, the Buddha warns his disciples against attachment to rites, rituals, and beliefs, the latter apparently rejecting dogmatic philosophical speculation altogether. Similarly, when encountering a disputant who does not share the Buddha's worldview, the Buddha seeks out common ground and bases any further discussion with them on such common ground as can be identified, and reasoning from there. Invariably, he leads the inquirer to a higher, more comprehensive understanding. Thus, he rejects disputatiousness altogether as a method of knowing. The relationship between knowledge and attachment is made explicit at the end of the sutta, where the Buddha summarizes the 62 wrong views, saying of each one, quote, "That is merely the feeling of those who do not know and see, the worry and vacillation of those immersed in craving," unquote. The implication is that these views are personal, subjective, and rooted in craving or attachment. At the same time, it is clearly implicit that there is something to know and see, and that there are those who know and see, the wise, since falsehood and error can only be identified in relation to truth and correctness, and only one who knows the truth can identify error. The Buddha proceeds to analyze the nature of feeling and craving with reference to contact, the 6 sense bases: clinging, becoming, birth, and aging and death. These are, of course, the 5th through 12th nidanas, or links, in the chain of dependent origination, the paticca samuppada, which we will discuss in detail later on in the series. The Buddha says, quote, when monks, a monk understands as they really are the arising and passing away of the 6 bases of contact, their attraction and peril, and the deliverance from them, he knows that which goes beyond all these views," unquote. The 6 bases of contact are the organs of the 6 senses: eye, ear, tongue, body, and mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What have I missed? Sight, sound, taste. Taste. Tongue, of course, is... No, tongue is taste. What have I missed? Sight, hearing, sound, tactile, thinking. I'm missing a sense there. Come on, help me out. Smell. Thank you very much. Nose. Thank you very much, K.J. Inglewood. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, the 6 senses, affirming that the super-knowledge of a Tathagata is transmental, and that such super-knowledge is not unknowable, but is attainable by realization, despite the previous rejection of direct realization as an intrinsically reliable method of obtaining truth in connection with finitism, infinitism, and nibbana here and now. The Buddha denigrates the views of the ascetics and Brahmins who speculate about the past and or the future as both fixed and speculative. Quote, These are all trapped in the net with its 62 divisions, and wherever they emerge and try to get out, they are caught and held in this net. Just as a skilled fisherman or his apprentice might cover a small piece of water with a fine meshed net, thinking whatever larger creatures there may be in this water, they are all trapped in the net, caught and held in the net. So it is with all these. They are trapped and caught in this net, unquote. Thus I have translated the title of this sutta, The Great Entanglement. Now, armed with this information, let's look again at the 9 theories in the light of what we know about Buddhist principles, and see if we can discern the essential error in each case, even though this goes beyond the universe of discourse of this sutta. To recap, 1. Eternalism is the belief that the self and the world are eternal. 2. Partly eternalism and partly non-eternalism is the belief that the self and the world are partly eternal and partly non-eternal. Note that the third logical category, non-eternalism, is absent. Here is our first clue. 3. Finitism is the belief that the world is finite and bounded. 4. Non-infinitism is the belief that the world is infinite and unbounded. 5. Eel-wriggling is agnosticism. That the Buddha rejects this doctrine is our second clue. 6. Chance originationism is the belief that the self and the world arise by chance. 7. Post-mortem survivalism is the belief that after death the self is healthy and conscious. 8. Annihilationism, or annihilationalism, is the belief that after death the self is healthy and unconscious. And 9. Nibbana, here and now, is the belief that the self experiences nirvana in some state. The key to understanding the Buddha's rejection of all of these theories lies in the Buddha's repeated reference to attachment. We know that attachment leads to samsaric rebirth. What is attachment? It is that which posits self-identity, permanence, and satisfactoriness, whereas we know from the other suttas that the 3 marks of existence, the tilakkhana, are non-self-identity, impermanence, and change and suffering. If we apply this key to the 9 theories just enumerated, we find that each one contains a vital flaw that leads to attachment. The views that the self and the world are eternal or even partly eternal, finite or infinite, arise by chance, survive death, or are annihilated and achieve nirvana in a samsaric state. The 4th jhana is still a samsaric state. All violate the 3 marks of existence. Similarly, eel-wriggling violates the 3 marks of existence by denying that there is a knowable truth. This is the error of those who deny that the Buddha had an ontology. Thus, we see that the key to the Buddha's repudiation of these theories is the fact of attachment, the craving that intrinsically posits self-identity, permanence, and satisfactoriness. We might call this process objectification. Implicitly, therefore, the super-knowledge of a Tathagata is this realization of the 3 marks, which is an ontological realization through which spiritual realization is purified of attachment and thus paradoxically leads to the realization of the Dhamma, the Tat, suchness, reality as it is, beyond samsara, which is self-identical, permanent, and ecstatic. Ananda asks the Buddha what this sutta should be called, implying that Ananda was self-consciously memorizing the discourses with the Buddha's approval, and the Buddha replies that it may be called the net of advantage, the net of Dhamma, the supreme net, hence Walsh's title, the net of views, or the incomparable victory in battle. The reference to Ananda implies that this sutta was not the first sutta of the Buddha, as we discussed at the beginning, but was rather delivered during the final 25 years of the Buddha's career. Ananda becoming the Buddha's personal attendant in the 20th year of his ministry, between the 55th and 80th years of the Buddha. The sutta reports that when the Buddha delivered the sutta, the whole energy system of the universe vibrated. This is the only sutta in the Digha Nikaya of which this is said. So, to summarize, the Brahmajala Sutta, or the Great Entanglement, is an extensive discussion of moral practice and wrong view, culminating in a discussion of the nature of realization of the Tathagata. The Buddha informs us that all of the moral virtues for which one would praise the Tathagata are actually trivial, superficial things that might impress vulgar, ignorant people due to their obviousness, but are really of limited value and importance. Thus, the commentary says, quote, "Morality is inferior in comparison with higher qualities, for morality does not reach the excellence of concentration, nor concentration the excellence of wisdom," unquote. Similarly, a wide variety of metaphysical speculations concerning the nature of the self and the world are also denigrated. These speculations, rooted in craving and attachment, will only lead the believer to be reborn in the world corresponding to his particular outlook, because they are all based on the same error, the error of which attachment itself is the symptom, that is the ignorance of the three marks of non-self-identity, impermanence, and suffering that characterizes the special realization of the Tathagata. These speculations are contrasted with the super-knowledge of the Tathagata, the Buddha himself, which means he who has reached the Absolute. The super-knowledge of a Tathagata transcends all of these philosophical theories. It's trans-rational and dispassionate, and it is rooted in the realization of the Tat, the Absolute, reality as it is, truth, of which the realization of the three marks is an expression. This is the true Dhamma that is only discernible by a few, the wise. In addition, the Brahmajala Sutta includes references to some basic conceptual structures that appear throughout the suttas, including the tetralemma, or fourfold negation, the four jhanas, or meditative accomplishments, and the chain of dependent origination, the paticca samuppada, based on the 12 nidanas, or links. And we will be discussing these concepts in detail in future talks. That concludes my Dharma talk for today. Thank you very much for those of you who survived to the end. I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss Dharma with you. Next week, we will be discussing the second sutta of the Digha Nikaya. And if you give me just 1 second, I will tell you what it is. Okay, it is called the Samanya Pala Sutta, the Fruits of the Homeless Life. And I'll type it for you. M-A-N-A-P-H-A-L-A. You can read it online. I'm sure you can find a translation. You'll probably find it at Access to Insight. I am, of course, using the Walsh translation, but the translations do not differ so much that it will make a great difference. So before we proceed to the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions or anything they would like to discuss? "62 wrong views." That's correct. And as I said, this talk will be available on note card. I haven't actually put it on the note card yet. So give me half an hour or so to do that, and then I will send it to you. If you would like a copy of the talk on note card, please send me an IM at the end of the talk. Also, I do suggest you join my group, the Dharma Transmission to the West group. And I will post messages there relevant to my activities in Second Life, including the name of the next sutta to be discussed. I'll do that every week. And anything else that's relevant. Sometimes things that might not be appropriate to post to the Buddha Center. I will post to the Dharma Transmission to the West group. It's free to join. Any questions or discussion? I'll give you a minute. Otherwise, we'll proceed with the dedication of merit. I noticed a few comments flying past. Ed asked, do you study the Lotus Sutra too? I haven't, I've read it, parts of it. I have not studied it intensively. I've had it in the back of my mind to do a talk on the Lotus Sutra at some point because it is so popular. I do read Mahayana sutras, although I'm particularly interested in the Mahayana view of the Pali suttas. I have a study program which on my blog, which I recommend, which is my own study program. I'm very impressed by the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment. That's my favorite Mahayana sutra so far. I do read Mahayana sutras, but I haven't made a systematic or intensive study of them. I want to complete my study of the Pali Canon first. I'm fulfilling a personal vow to read the Pali Canon through 5 times. I'm on my second go-through, and I've published the book Fundamental View, which is an overview of the Pali Canon. And this book, of course, it's kind of going to come out of these talks, my commentaries on the Digha Nikaya. I'm hoping to complete my studies of the Pali Canon within 5 years and then go on to an intensive study of the Mahayana Sutras. I don't know how many I will read because there are approximately 2,000 Mahayana Sutras. Somehow I doubt I will be able to read them all. But from time to time I read various Mahayana Sutras online, and I think the Mahayana Sutras are extraordinarily profound and certainly come from authentic realization. But I do believe that it is important to ground one's understanding in the Pali texts. As I mentioned in the beginning, the president of the Pali Text Society commented that the whole history of Buddhism is essentially a reaction to the Pali Canon, which parallels a similar statement which you'll read in relation to Western philosophy, that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. All of Buddhism is a footnote to the Pali Canon. And when you study the Pali Canon intensively and in detail, you find all of the Mahayana concepts there in embryo. So there really is no distinction between Hinayana and Mahayana. That's really a conceptual distinction. The Buddha taught Dhamma. He did not teach Mahayana or Hinayana or Vajrayana. He taught Ekayana. He taught the totality. And that's the perspective that I have. Any other questions before we proceed with the dedication of merit? I see quite a few people survived to the end. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hopefully it depends on the sutta, of course. Because of the introductory portion on the Pali Canon, this talk ran to about an hour and a half. I think most of the talks will run to about an hour. But of course, it depends on the sutta. I'm not going to shortchange any sutta because of time, but I am going to try to present each sutta in each talk as a singularity, so that the totality of the sutta is fresh in everyone's mind, and that will take 34 weeks to do. And also because I did discuss this sutta in the context of a larger understanding of Dhamma, and of course explained the constituent concepts. The actual point of today's sutta is really not explicit in the sutta. You have to understand it in the context of all the other suttas in order to really understand it. So it's left as a mystery what the resolution of these 62 wrong views is. But when you study it closely in the context of Dhamma, you realize what it is. It's the attachment that underlies those 62 views that causes them to be wrong. Otherwise, a number of those views actually approximate to the Buddhist worldview. Any other comments or questions or discussion? I don't know about you, but I am boiling hot. I must have activated my tumo. Okay, it seems like there are no more questions. So let's proceed to dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dhamma. We will return next Saturday to discuss the second sutta of the Digha Nikaya, and I will repost the name of that sutta in a notice to the Dharma transmission to the West group. So if you have not joined that group, I do suggest that you do so, and it will give you access to. We could also have conversations during the week. I'm perfectly open to using the chat in that group to have conversations, provided they're relevant to the subject matter of the group. So thank you very much. Namaskar. Until next week.